Thanks for coming today. Happy Women's History Month. It's very exciting. Before I introduce our guest, I just want to thank our sponsor of refreshments today. Annabelle from Care One and Sharon was here and dropped off all those delicious pastries. Yes, very nice. So thank you to Annabelle. So we have Ann Bishop here today, and I've really just enjoyed chatting with her about her story, about what brings her here to speak about women senators and coming to speak to senior centers in general. So I'm going to let her do the honors. Thank you, Ann.
Thank you. So how did I come here and who am I? So I am a retired pediatric nurse practitioner, and I call myself the urban pioneer because every job I had was the first time we did it in the city of Boston. The first time nurses didn't wear uniforms. That didn't last very long at Boston Floating Hospital. The first nurse practitioner to work in a neighborhood health center in Dorchester. The first nurse practitioner to work at Cathedral High School running the health office and teaching violence prevention curriculums. The first nurse practitioner to run a school-based health center for the city of Boston. And then I was also an adjunct professor at Simmons University teaching in the graduate nursing program. And then I retired. I retired in 2015, and I immediately became a visitor experience volunteer at the Edward M. Kennedy Institute for the United States Senate. My whole family is very interested in history and politics. My father was assigned in the Army to the Philippines before the war broke out. So if you know anything about the Pacific War, he survived the Bataan Death March, the hell ships to Japan, 3.5 years in Japanese prison camps, and came home, and immediately with a group of POWs from the Boston area started the American Defenders of Bataan and Corregidor organization that was the basis of my childhood. We were always going to memorials, and my father made sure that every April 9th on the fall of Bataan, the governor celebrated it somehow. So we were always interested in history, and I just loved being at the Edward M. Kennedy Institute. And they had a screen there that would show you the Congress as it moved through time. So you would have the first Congress of Senators, and then every 20 seconds it would move to the next one and the next one. And everybody wanted to talk about John Glenn and Sam Houston and Robert Kennedy, but I kept noticing these women's faces popping up, and there was nothing in the handbook that they gave the volunteers, so I started researching. And by the end of my time there, I was the expert on the first 3 women senators that you've never heard of. Unfortunately, the Kennedy Institute closed down to open visitor experiences with COVID, and they've never really come back. They went to Zooms, and it's a long story, but we keep hoping that they'll bring it back. But that's how I got to be really interested in this topic. I became part of this program because my mother passed away 1.5 years ago at 103 and 8 months, with all of her faculties intact. She had a few health problems, but she lived in her own condo with help from her daughters and her sons who lived far away periodically. But she was fine until she was old. That was that. But my mother was always telling me to go to the Council of Aging, and I was always telling her I was too young. She was very active. She and my father ran all the trips every 2 months. They took overnight trips. She went to their coffee and conversation every week. She was really involved with it. And she made best friends with a professor from MIT who actually invented the personal computer. And they were in their, late 90s and early hundreds, best pals. It was really interesting. So my mother passed away, and unfortunately, it's part of my story, but my daughter-in-law's mother had ALS. And 1 month after my mother passed away, my daughter-in-law's mother passed away. So if I wasn't taking care of my mother, I was taking care of my grandchildren so I could help out my daughter-in-law. And then I had nothing to do. and I was in deep grief. So it took a year to kind of pull my act together. But I did start going to the Council of Aging, and I'd say to my sisters, Mom would be so proud of me, you know. And I started taking art classes, and then there was this therapy gardens class on herb gardening, and I am a gardener. So I went. And when Dave Williams, who's the owner of the company, said, we also do classes on healthy living, I literally could feel my mother pushing me to the front of the room when the lecture was over. And I said, are you hiring? And he said, what can you do for me? And I said, well, I'm a retired nurse practitioner with a master's in public health and health education and health promotion. And he goes, you're hired. And then when he hired me, I said, you know, I have this great talk on the 3 women senators. Every time I give this talk, and this is the 4th time, so it's building in popularity. I've never had less than 30 people. This is the largest crowd. It's been a long time since I've stood in front of an audience this big, because I used to give a lot of presentations at conferences as a nurse practitioner, but that was a long time ago. So hopefully I won't lose my track of thinking here, and I can tell you the stories. Every time I research a little bit more, there's so much more to say about these 3 women and how they came to be senators. But we're going to start with Rebecca Felton. So here we go. Rebecca Felton was born on June 10th, 1835 in Decatur, Georgia. She died in Atlanta, Georgia at a ripe old age of, what? She was very old, in her 90s. I forget. So how did she get to Georgia in 1835? That's really a long time ago. So this is how she got there. Her ancestors go back to 1645, and her 2 great-grandfathers took an oath of allegiance to General Washington and served under him. So when these people, and they were rich, when they served under, when the war was over, they got land, they got jobs, they got money, they were rewarded. So her great-grandfathers, the Latimer family, lived on the Potomac River in a huge mansion, and they were very wealthy. The ruins are still in a national park because a lot of historic things happened along the Potomac River. The mansion is gone now, but there are still the ruins there, and you can identify it. So Rebecca's grandfather, who's very wealthy, takes advantage of the Yazoo land fraud that opened up in Georgia. So in Georgia, it's 1800, it's the Wild West, right? There's no railroad there, there's no telegraph there, there's no grocery stores, there's no general store like you see in the movies. They were there. And how did they get there? Well, they needed to get land. How did they get land? Who did the land belong to? Who were they buying it off of? They weren't buying it off of anybody. They just took the land, because Native Americans did not have the concept of owned land. So these politicians, including the governor and the senators, came up with this scheme to sell land in Georgia on the cheap. But they sold the land over and over again. It was this big fraud issue. But Rebecca's grandfather somehow manages to get this big tract of land in Georgia. So how does he get there? There's no railroad, so they had to have traveled by stagecoach, or I don't think they did a wagon train. I can't find it anywhere how the family got there, but they end up in Georgia on a huge tract of land. And what does her grandfather do in the 1800s but buy enslaved people and builds a huge, huge mansion? So let's go to, so she is born on this plantation that is 725 acres. The family is very wealthy, and I'll explain a little bit more about how that came about. Besides coming with wealth, they had to sustain their wealth. The home is described as having colonial-style white columns. At that time, approximately 17% of the population was enslaved, around 87,000 plus people. The total population was only 500,000. So there's 500,000 people in Georgia at that time. We don't know how much the native population was there, but it was pretty substantial. And Rebecca remembers as a young 3-year-old child watching the natives from Florida be traipsed into Georgia under the Trail of Tears, and they marched down the main street of her town. But in her books, she has written 3 books in her 90s. She describes the relationships with the Native Americans as cordial, that they bargained with each other and they interacted with each other. They had their separate spaces, but they were interchanging because of commerce. And she always had great respect for the Native Americans, and there's nothing that I've read so far that shows anything about raids or fighting or killing people or anything like that. Her father was Charles Latimer. Her mother was Eleanor Swift Latimer. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about what life was like in 1835. At the time of Rebecca's childhood, there's no railroads. There's no telegraph office. So how did they get goods? They got them from the land. They had cotton on the land. They had a grain mill. They grew wheat. They had a sawmill. They cut down logs to build things. They had horses, pigs, hens, geese, cows, gardens. They grew cotton, and they harvested wool from sheep, and then they brought it into this big house, on the big room in the lower part of the house, and they cleaned the cotton, and they cleaned the wool, and they washed it, and they turned it into thread and yarn, and then they wove it, and then they made clothes out of it. They didn't buy anything back then. They ground the wheat for cooking, and they used the water residue as starch. They made their own soap. They made their own candles because there was no kerosene. And remember, there's no railroad, so the only communication they have is when a stagecoach comes in, or maybe a wagon train with another group of people. There's no telegraph, so they had to provide for themselves. There was no kerosene until the railroad came in the late 1800s, so that's when they began to get some goods from the north. So if they wanted a mattress, they plucked the goose and filled cotton with the goose feathers, and they made a mattress. If they wanted a blanket, they took the ends of the yarn and cotton that they wove, and they made quilts out of it. That's how they made their pillows. Rebecca never had a stove until she was a young woman. Cooking was always done on the fireplace. And all the girls in the family worked these industries along with the enslaved people, because they not only had to make clothes for themselves, they had to make clothes for the enslaved people. They had a 750-acre plantation. There's no number of how many slaves they had other than to say they had a lot, and they had to take care of them. She remembers her grandmother. So they built this big mansion for the grandfather, and then his children lived in the mansion. So there were like 13 people of the family living in the mansion at any one time. She remembers her grandmother's skill as a homemaker. With an eye single to her domestic, this is Rebecca speaking, with an eye single to her domestic duties and diligent attention to home economies, the grandmother trotted around, Rebecca trotted around her grandmother as she went from the dwelling to the garden, to the milk dairy, to the poultry house, to the loom house, to the big meat house where rations were issued once a day, to the flour and meal house where there was always a superabundance of supplies. She had fowls of all domestic kinds to look after. There were fattening pigs in the pen. They had geese for the feathers, and because I told you about the mattresses, and there was no such things as comforts back then. If someone was getting married, the whole community made them quilts and mattresses and things for them to start up, and they would make a new dress. All the women wore what they call the horseshoe bonnets, the round, you see those in the old TV shows and movies, because they didn't like getting tanned. So they were always wearing long sleeves and these bonnets so that they wouldn't get tanned. And that meant you were rich. So that was the life. All the family people worked together side by side with the enslaved people to keep this plantation going. And the people in the house worked side by side, cleaning the cotton, making the thread, weaving the cotton, making the fabric so that they could make waistcoats for the men out of the wool and dresses for the women out of the cotton. It's a very different kind of thought that we might have of what the South was like. This is not her mansion, but it doesn't exist anymore. And this is in the 1907, but this is an example of what the mansions looked like back then with the white columns, and the slave quarters would be in the back, close enough for them to get to the mansion, but not close enough so that they were part of the architecture scenery. So Rebecca's smart, and her parents send her to school. And she, let's see, no? Okay. So her parents send her to school, and in those days they studied Greek and Latin and economics and elocution and English and French. You know, they were well educated if they went to school. So she's at her graduation, she's 17 years old, and William H. Felton is a physician, a legislator, a Methodist minister, a plantation owner, and he had a lot of enslaved people on his property, and he's a widower. He's 12 years older than Rebecca. So he's born in 1823, and he dies in 1909, 2 decades before Rebecca. So Rebecca's father said, you got to be 18 to get married. So she gets married in October of 1853. And she moves into her husband's plantation. And now she knows how to be a plantation mistress because she lived under her mother and her grandmother who did it. And so she knew what her job was. She had 5 children, but only Howard survives to adulthood. And she enjoyed the privileges of being a wealthy plantation mistress. She describes in her memoirs as having considerable number of slaves, but she also, later in life, in her 90s, describes her life back then as being that of a sheltered potted plant. Women had no rights. They couldn't own property. They obviously couldn't vote. They couldn't hold office. They were there to keep the family running, and the only right they had was the right to protection by their husband. And if they messed up, they could be kicked out of the house. So there was a lot of pressure to be a good wife and mother and take good care of the home fires burning. And in her later years, she's a strong woman suffragist and really did not like that idea of being a sheltered potted plant. This is her husband. He looks a bit stern. And he was 12 years older than her, so she's 18 years old, you know, and he's 30. I don't know. So now the Civil War breaks out. So here we have people living side by side, not to say that this was a good thing at all, but there were relationships. A woman named Agnes was assigned to Rebecca as a baby. So she was her nanny, and then she was her nurse as Rebecca got older. But she was with Rebecca from birth until the day she got married at 18. We don't know if Agnes had a family of her own, if she was allowed to have a family of her own. But in Rebecca's writing, she's always talking about Nurse Agnes bringing her this or getting her that or watching her here or there. So the woman did her job and nurtured this child because the mom was busy feeding the pigs, making sure somebody was feeding the pigs. So the war breaks out, and William joins the Confederate Army as a MD. So what do you suppose happens? The women are left on the plantations with the enslaved people for which the war is being fought, so they can free them. So the women get scared, and they get more rigid, and they have this, we know about this, that most lynchings happened because people thought that a black man insulted a white woman in some way, and the easiest way to deal with that was to lynch them. And Georgia had the second most number of lynches in the time that we had lynching. So the women become fearful of an uprising, and the relationships change. And Rebecca slips into some very supremacist, racist ideas, one of them being lynching is a good thing. And if you have to lynch people to stop them from assaulting women, then that's what you have to do, and do it as much as you have to do it. And she wrote about that in a newspaper, and it followed her through life. Her husband comes home, and he becomes a congressional representative, and he serves 3 terms, and then he serves 3 terms in the state. So he goes to Washington, D.C. So she spends some time in Washington, D.C. She's mostly at home, keeping the plantation going. But she gets a taste of power. And the women in Washington, D.C. have a little bit more than she does. And they're talking about suffrage. So she comes back when he comes back as a state legislator, and she only has the 1 child. She's looking for something to do. So she becomes her husband's campaign manager. Remember, she's very erudite. She's been well educated, and she's been in Washington, D.C. for 6 years. So she knows a little bit about politics and what people need to do to be successful. So the women in this early days, because they didn't have huge staff, the wives and maybe even the daughters, they got really involved in the back office. Oh, you got to talk to this one. Oh, this one's upset about this. You got to address that. That was kind of beginning to be her role. And she helps write his speeches, and she was an equal partner in his political life. In 1885, she buys a newspaper simply to promote his career. And then later, she writes for the Atlantic Journal from 1898 to 1920, sort of as a Heloise, like how to garden, how to live the country life. It was called the country life. But it connected that family with the people of the community, so it made them more popular, and it made Rebecca very popular. And around this time, she is involved in women's suffrage, and she has a national reputation for fighting for women's suffrage. They called her the political she of Georgia, and later she became known as the grande dame of Georgian politics. Have you ever heard of that? No? When I was at the Edward M. Kennedy Institute for the United States Senate, and Harvard University would come by with their students, not one person knew the name of the first 3 women senators. They all said Margaret Chase Smith, but there were 3 ahead of her, and they didn't know it. We don't learn about it. She writes my memoirs of Georgia politics, country life in Georgia, and days of my youth. And I have a copy of her Country Life in Georgia. She's not a very good writer. She's all over the place. But when she's writing an essay piece, it's very, very interesting, and it's a lot of what I mentioned to you. So how does she become the first woman senator? In 1890, she campaigns for prohibition. That's pretty typical of the women of those days, because the husbands were always sitting around drinking and then going to bed and not being very productive as husbands. So she's against leasing convicts, particularly for an incident where she sees along the side of the road a chain gang. And there's a 12-year-old African-American girl on the chain gang. And she's appalled, and she wants to get her released. So she goes to the sheriff's office, and he goes, forget about it. She stole 50 cents. She's doing 12 years. She tried very hard to get that young girl off, but she was not successful. So from that moment on, she was against chain gangs, and she's known for that and wrote about that. And then for women's rights, because she was sick of being a potted, sheltered plant. She writes for the Atlantic Journal and gets popular, and then they get the vote, and there's all this hullabaloo, yay, yay, yay. And part of the reason that the women got the vote is because in all the little nooks and crannies of this country, women organized. They had their societies, they had their associations, they had their clubs, and they pushed and pushed and pushed until it got passed. So it didn't just happen at the upper levels, it really happened down in the communities. So Thomas Watson dies in office, the Georgia senator. And there's 4 months before the next regular election. So they're not going to have a special election because it's just 4 months. But the governor has to appoint somebody to fill in the space because that's what they did. So he did not agree with women's suffrage, but he really wants to be the senator. So he decides to appoint Rebecca, 87-year-old Rebecca, to be the interim senator until the next election, thinking the women would vote for him. The other, Walter George, known as a suffragist, is sworn in. So Rebecca is assigned a seat way at the back of the Senate, and if they open up the Edward M. Kennedy Institute again, or your Council of Aging could get a trip there because they will take groups, you will go into the chamber and see the chamber, and you can identify Rebecca Felton's chair. So they put her in the back of the room, and they don't pay much attention to her. But Walter George, he says, "Did you ever get sworn in?" And she goes, "No." He goes, "Mm-mm." He refuses to be sworn in as the next senator from Georgia unless Rebecca is officially sworn in. So 24 hours before he is sworn in, she is sworn in. And she speaks to a large group of people, of the senators, and talks on the integrity of women in the political process, and that it's about time we had them. And then she retires and writes her books. So that's how we have the first woman senator for 24 hours. Now, because she's raised before emancipation, she's a woman of her time, and enslaved people are part of her history. Lynching in Georgia, the overall total of 458 victims, second only to Mississippi to 538. That's during the time that lynching was around and wasn't illegal. And that'll come up later when we talk about one of the other women senators. And this is the infamous article that she writes that trails after her for her entire life. If lynching would, quote, protect women's dearest possession, so that's their virginity, from the ravening human beasts, that's the enslaved men, then I say lynch 1,000 times a week if necessary. And she never, ever gave up on that. She, of course, in those days, if we know your history of women's history and the vote, they passed the vote for white women, not for black women, and the black women were told to take a back step until we can get this taken care of, and then we'll get you on the voting list. So she had no problem with that whatsoever. This is her in her aged time. Obviously, she played the guitar. And so in her one and only speech before the Senate, she speaks on the value of women. She's assigned the seat. She continues to write and lecture. She was 94 when she died. She finished her final book, The Romantic Story of Georgia Women, shortly before her death, and she's buried at Oak Hill Cemetery in Georgia, and her papers are at the Rose Lawn Museum. I can't get a copy of The Romantic Story of Georgia Women. I think it's out of date, and the other book that she wrote is like $100. This one I could get for a reasonable amount of money, and it's this, as I said, the story of her life written in her own hand. So when the lecture's over, you're invited to come up and take a look at that. So the next women's senator is Hattie Caraway, but she served over 14 years, so we're going to save her for last, and we're going to go to Rose McConnell Long. Can anybody guess who her husband was? Huey Long, that's right. So Rose is born in Greensville, Indiana, and she dies in Boulder, Colorado, but she's the Democratic senator from Louisiana. I'm just going to refer to my notes on her in case I forget something. Her parents were Peter and Armitage, or Sally McConnell. Rose had one brother, Gilman, and her father had a daughter from a previous marriage. The family moves from Indiana to Shreveport, Louisiana, when Rose is 9. She attended a public school, a secretarial school, but ultimately worked as a teacher, and her brother became a veterinarian. Again, I went to school at Boston College in the late 1960s, but I could only be a nurse or a teacher. They did not let women in the School of Arts and Sciences or the business school until my senior class stomped our feet, raised our fists, and said, enough of this. We want to take our electives in the School of Arts and Sciences, and they let us. And 2 years later, they admitted women into the School of Arts and Sciences. So it wasn't that long ago that women didn't have a lot of options. And when I was a young nurse at Boston Floating Hospital, there were no women pediatricians. They were all men. And the only 2 women doctors I ever came across in my 2 years working there were foreign. So it's not that long ago. She attends, okay, so at 18, Rose enters a baking contest to promote cotylene, a lard substitute. Sounds disgusting. But Huey Long, a local salesman, very entrepreneurial from the get-go, was one of the judges. They had a 2.5-year courtship ending in marriage in a hotel in Memphis, Tennessee in 1913. And the word is, he didn't have the $10 to pay the justice of the peace. Rose had to pay it. And this is a picture of Rose and Huey. So looking like people in the 1930s, right? So Rose supported Huey by working as a school teacher while he attended law school. And then he opened his own law office. They had 3 children together, Rose Lolita Long McFarland, Palmer Reed Long, and Russell B. Long, who was also a senator from Louisiana. Huey Long is known as the Kingfish, or the boss. His nickname indicated he was tough, right? His mother instilled in him her children's strong sense of duty to those less fortunate. She would send Huey and his siblings to visit neighbors in need of help, bringing them food and clothing. It is said he inherited his mother's intelligence and her photographic memory. Did you know he had a photographic memory? That's one of the reasons why people can get very successful. If you can remember everything that happens, you can be very successful. But it also means that he did fight for the common man. So his mother's influence was really strong. As a governor, his motto was share the wealth. And he instituted many social programs and expanded public work projects. In the Senate, he also worked for the underprivileged. He had a heavy hand, though, and was impeached by his political enemies in 1929, but it went nowhere. Does that sound familiar? By all reports, Rose supports her husband's career as a lawyer, as the governor of Louisiana from 1928 to 1932, and as the U.S. Senator from 1932 to September 8, 1935, when he's assassinated at the age of 42. He's killed by the son-in-law of a representative that Huey Long was trying to gerrymander out of his district. Yeah. Rose, as a devoted wife and mother, was the norm in the 20th century. She had no known political aspirations. And after the death of her husband, she moved to Baton Rouge to be near her son, Russell, who was attending school there. But she was the wife of a governor and a U.S. senator. So her job was also to be the hostess. So who is she hostessing in those years? Presidential candidates, other people in the Congress, and he is one of those senators that back home, he's answering his constituents' concerns. So it's like, you have a concern, you go to Huey Long, you're going to get something, some kind of action out of it. So after Huey Long's untimely death, so all that is to just say that Rose had no intention of being in politics, but she knew a lot about politics, and she knew a lot of people. And she knew Hattie Caraway and her husband Thaddeus, which becomes important when we learn about Hattie. So after Huey Long's untimely death, Governor James A. Noe decides to enact the widow's succession. So it's very popular with representatives, but it hadn't been used too much in the Senate. But here he enacts it, and so the widow's succession takes place when a congressman dies and his wife takes the seat. And traditionally, if appointed to the congressional seat, the widow is only supposed to act as a placeholder for her dead husband. And she's supposed to give it up when the next election comes in. So if the person dies early in their term, they have a special election. If they die late in their term, they just wait for the next election. But in Rose's case, her husband dies early in his 2 years, or 6 years, he's a senator now, 6 years, so they have to hold a special election. So she's just there for a few months until that happens. This was not the case with Rose. The governor appoints her to fill in until a special election, but Rose does decide to continue. So a lot of Huey's backers want her to stay in the Senate because they know that she will support his programming and his political aspirations. Huey Long wanted to be president, and he did a lot of maneuvering to get himself into a position where people would support him for president. So Rose is along with him meeting all of these people. So all these people say to Rose, look, we need you. You gotta go forward with this. So she does, and she wins the special election. So she fills in her husband's full term. So she serves the remaining months of her husband's term. She chose not to be a candidate for the next election in the fall of 1936. It has been reported that Rose and Hattie Caraway, the second U.S. woman senator, so Hattie's already in the Senate, become friends. And this was the first time we had two women senators until decades later. They gave Hattie, because she was the second, Rebecca Felton seat, but they put Rose next to her, so they had them at the back of the room. It has been reported that she was supposed to be called Mrs. Huey Long in the list of senators, and they did swear her in, and that was supposed to be what she was sworn in on, Mrs. Huey Pierce Long. However, she insists on being listed as Rose McConnell Long. This was a monumental achievement, but think back to the days when a woman couldn't get a credit card in her own name. It was Mrs. So-and-so. Not that long ago. That happened to me. So women only had the right to vote for 14 years. So it was a big deal that ended up being okayed. So Rose and Hattie were the only two women to serve together for a very short period of time until decades later. Rose supports her husband's policies, and she was said to serve with diligence, intelligence, and grace. After Rose's time in the Senate, she moves to Boulder, Colorado to be near her daughter, Rose Lolita Dolly, and Dolly served as her mother's secretary. So I think that's pretty interesting that the mom and the daughter were in the Senate offices together. And Rose dies at the age of 78. So that's our third woman senator. And so now Hattie Caraway, who has the longest term as one of the first three women senators. So this is just what I said about her dying then. So this is Hattie Ophelia Wyatt Caraway. Wow, where do you hear her background? So she's born in 1878. So slavery's only been over for 12 years in Humphrey County, Tennessee, where they had slaves. She died December 21st, 1950 in Falls Church, Virginia, and she was the Democratic senator from Arkansas. So what was her life like? So Hattie's born on February 1st, 1878, in a family farm near the community of Bakersville in Humphreys County. She was 4 years old when the family moves to Huttsburg, also known as Humphreys County, later known as the birthplace of Loretta Lynn. So you know how poor that area was, you know? Hattie's father is a farmer and a shopkeeper and was married to a woman named Harriet O'Gwynn. They had 6 surviving children. So they had children that died, and they were Hattie's half-siblings. After his first wife dies, he married, so Hattie is not a child of his first wife. So her father remarries to her mother, Lucy Mildred Birch Wyatt, and they have 4 children. So now there's 10 children in the family, living on a farm and working in the father's small general store. And she's the youngest. When Hattie's father was 60, she was born when her father was 60 and she was 16. And they were a family of modest means working hard to keep the family together. But Hattie looked around and said, I am not going to be a farmer's wife, and I am not going to stay in this general store. I want out. And she's the youngest, so she was probably a little coddled. You know, she probably didn't have to do as much as the other children in the family had to do. So she convinces an aunt to pay for her education if she maintained good grades. And so the aunt sends Hattie and her older sister Mosey to the Dixon Normal School, later known as the Dixon Normal College in Dixon, Tennessee. Hattie entered at the age of 14 and graduates 4 years later with a bachelor's degree of arts. At the time, the curriculum was designed to train young women to be teachers. So again, the subjects are Greek, Latin, math, science, bookkeeping, elocution, history, geography, penmanship, physical education. So I have to stop on the elocution. So when my youngest sister entered first grade, my mother got a job working in the Watertown public school system for the speech and hearing department that was run by one of her best friends, Eleanor McBreen. And Eleanor McBreen never married, as did her sister Pat, and they both became very successful women in their own areas. And Pat taught a lot of people in the Watertown public schools how to speak, debates and elocution. And a lot of them grew up to be lawyers and doctors and politicians. So time goes on, and the school department decides we don't need a department like this anymore. Who does elocution? Why do we do debates? We can have an after-school program on debates. And they want to close down the program. So they have a school committee meeting, and Eleanor goes to the school committee meeting and speaks to them on the value of her program. And they're all buzzing about, yeah, but my funds, blah, blah, blah. And then one of the members of the school committee stands up and he goes, listen, Miss McBreen taught me how to stand up, speak up, shut up, and sit down, and that's what you're all doing. We're not getting rid of that program. And it lasted until she retired. So I just have to say we don't teach elocution anymore. And But we do have debate teams, and we do encourage people to learn, young people, especially young girls now. I know this because my granddaughter is getting this in school, to stand up, speak up, be clear, bullet information. You don't want to digress too much. You just want to be very clear so that people know exactly where you're coming from and what the issue is with you. And I think that this had something to do with Hattie, even though she was known as Silent Hattie. We'll figure that out in a few minutes. So she graduates at 18 with a bachelor's degree. And this is a picture of her with her husband, Thad. So how does Thad come into the life? So while attending the Dixon School, she meets Thaddeus, known as Thad, Horatius Caraway, also a student at the Dixon School. Thad was born in 1871 in Spring Hill, Missouri. His father, now again, this is history, Tolbert Caraway, died when Thad was young. Tolbert was a physician and a Confederate veteran. So a physician, he made a decent living. When Thad was 6 months old, though, his father is killed in a duel. I didn't find anything about why he was in a duel, but it leaves the family destitute. So this is what Thad does to be a successful person in life. He attends the local common school while he worked as early as age 7 as a farmhand, sharecropper, and on the railroad. His mother, Mary Ellen Caraway, moved the family to Clay County, Arizona when he's 12. But he's able to attend the Dixon Normal School in Tennessee because he can pay for his schooling by working in a sawmill and picking cotton. Like Hattie, he taught school after graduation, but he studied law. And in 1900, he finally establishes a law office in Lake City, Arizona, and Hattie, age 24, and Thad, age 30. So see, it took him a long time to get through school, because he had to work all those different jobs in order to pay for his education. It seems they knew each other at least 6 years before their marriage and had a long engagement. Perhaps they waited until Thad had established his law practice and was able to support a wife and family. To the next page. So, Hattie enjoys a happy home life, raising her first 2 sons, Paul and Forrest, and managing the family farm, and being a member and subsequent secretary of the local 20th Century Club. So here's the Women's Club coming up again. They were very popular in those days. And then they moved to Washington, D.C. in 1913 when Thad becomes a member of Congress. And their 3rd child, Robbie, is born there. And Bobby was known as Bobby, attended West Point, as did his older brothers, who embarked on military careers. Bobby, however, the youngest in the family, a little coddled, I'm sure, his mother's favorite, even though we're not supposed to have favorites, enjoys horseback riding as a cadet. And during the summer break after his 2nd year, he fractures his skull after a fall from his horse while riding with friends, and he fell into unconsciousness before his mother arrives at his bedside. She's heartbroken at the loss of this child and affectionately referred to her youngest as baby, and he's buried with his parents. So that was a very sad. She was lucky enough to have 3 pregnancies and 3 children that grew into adulthood, but she lost him. So then in 1920, Thad ran and is elected to the U.S. Senate, and eventually in 1926, they were able to purchase the Calvert Mansion in Riverdale Park, Maryland. This was a huge historical property dating back to 1801, so he's doing well. It's designed for the Baltimore family who established the city of Baltimore in 1632, so it's an old mansion. But after Thad's death, Hattie's unable to afford the mortgage, and the home is sold by the local sheriff to pay the mortgage and taxes. During the time the family lived in the mansion, Huey Long made use of the property during his 1832 campaign. So this is where I said that Hattie and Rose were friends, and Huey Long helped Thad Caraway, and Thad Caraway helped Huey Long. This was important friendship that benefited Hattie in her bid for office in 1932. Hattie's husband, let's see, I'm going backwards. Okay, so Hattie's husband, by all accounts, is a successful orator. So he learned elocution at the school. So he's a good orator. And a progressive senator, and when it came to supporting programs for his constituents, he was again somebody that if you went to his office around the state and asked for help, you got help. And they, Hattie and Thad, went to those places when they were home on break from the Senate job. And do we have another senator who always answered his constituents in our time? The Edward M. Kennedy for the United States Senate. When we first invaded Iraq, the soldiers only received protective wear if they were outside the green zone. And there was an attack inside the green zone, and this woman lost her son. And she wrote to Senator Kennedy and said they should all have this protective wear. And within 2 weeks, he got the law passed in Congress. If you were able to go there, they will tell you multiple stories. Title IX was because a woman was looked over in a college for a promotion. And so they passed Title IX to stop discrimination in the educational system. But while Ted Kennedy was on the committee, he got together with a bunch of his pals and said, we really should add sports. And within 2 decades, there were more women in the Olympics than there were men. The argument was girls don't play sports. Well, did anybody have after-school programs in their grammar school? Not me. I came home and helped my mother take care of my younger sisters. That was my after-school. My grandchildren, through their parents, have given me a Christmas gift called Storyworth. And once a week I get a question and I have to write an essay about it. And they asked me what were my favorite games and toys when I was growing up, and I said my 2 younger sisters. Because every day I took them out after school for a walk, or I babysat. My mother left me alone when I was 17 years old with my 2 brothers and my 2 sisters, so she and my father could go to a American Defenders of Bataan and Corregidor convention. And my younger sister got sick, and I called the doctor came to the house, she had a strep throat, we got the prescription, my mother came home and she said, why didn't you call me? And I said, left me in charge. I've been taking care of these kids my whole life. So anyway, that's a little digression, but makes it interesting. So Hattie moves, so where am I now? Hattie is a strong supporter of her, no, I don't want to go there yet. So Thad dies in office young at the age of 60 from a blood clot after kidney stone surgery, which would never happen now. They would have picked that up and he would have been taken care of. Hattie is a strong supporter of her husband's political beliefs because she is a politician's wife. She has been the wife of a senator. She has hosted important people. She's the only woman senator for 14 years. A lot of that time, Franklin Delano Roosevelt is president. Do you not imagine that she had a relationship with Eleanor Roosevelt? Because Hattie was a strong supporter of FDR's policies, and he was known to invite senators to the White House. So I am sure that I haven't been able to, I'm very busy these days giving these talks on all these topics, but it's one of the things I want to find out because I just cannot imagine that Eleanor Roosevelt did not know Hattie Caraway. It just doesn't make any sense that she wouldn't. When Thad was in office, Hattie's role was mainly that of wife and mother and manager of their home life, but she's also a hostess, and she knows all these people, and she and Rose were friends. She had the help of Fanny Cash, an African-American woman who was the family's cook and housekeeper while they lived in Washington, D.C. until her passing. Hattie acknowledged how indispensable Fanny was to her while she was in the Senate. So she acknowledges this woman as a good person in her life, but later we'll see she still had some of that old Southern roots in her. Although Hattie's public role while her husband was in office was not well known, she was very active behind the scenes. During his first congressional campaign in 1920, she worked at campaign headquarters and often spoke on his behalf. I'm sure she spoke about suffrage because he was in favor of it. She knew all of his, she was thought of as his political confidant. She knew all his positions on issues affecting constituents in Arkansas. Her husband is known as a reformer and progressive. He supported programs to help the farmers and people affected by the Great Depression. He supported entrance into the League of Nations, which wasn't always 100% popular. It was hard to get the vote to go through. You learn about that at the Edward M. Kennedy Institute, too. They have a whole program on Woodrow Wilson and the League of Nations. He was in favor of bonuses for World War I veterans, the 18th Amendment on Prohibition, the 19th Amendment on suffrage for women, and the 20th Amendment, which changed the dates from March to January for the presidential and the congressional campaigns. It must be mentioned that Thaddeus was also a supporter of racial discrimination. In 1921, he introduces a bill to prohibit African Americans from entering the Army or Navy, and he also proposed to segregate the public and private transportation options in Washington, D.C. So there were the Southern roots that came to play. When Thaddeus died suddenly in office, Hattie is the recipient of the widow's succession. So she takes over, as did Rose. She, again, is a few months ahead of Rose. So she's a congresswoman for a little while, and then Rose is in there for about a year and a half, and they were friends during that time. She was considered a safe choice by then Governor Harvey Parnell, as he could avoid appointing a potential rival for the seat in the upcoming election. Again, men without a clue that this is women who have just gotten the vote. What was he thinking? Hattie takes her seat on December 8th, 1931, and wins the special election in 1932 with the help of Huey Long, the very influential senator. And that's how she gets in there. And then she fulfills her husband's remaining term, and she was also successful in large part due to the Arkansas Democratic Women's Club that was specifically formed to raise money to support her candidacy, campaigned for her in public forums, and enlisted women volunteers to be election officials. No one expected Hattie to run for office as a candidate on her own merit in 1932, but Huey pushes her because he wants to be president and he wants Hattie in the Senate. She shocks the political establishment, beating out 6 male contenders for the seat. She was known to state, "The time has passed when a woman should be placed in a position and kept there only while someone else is being groomed for the job." Does that sound familiar? Hattie was elected with the help of Huey Long, who had his eye on the White House and wanted to show his support for women. She's elected in 1932 and 1938, thus serving for 14 years. She's given Rebecca Felton's seat, as I mentioned before. She only gave 15 speeches. I haven't the heart to take a minute away from the men. The poor dears love it so. But she was not paying attention. She was sometimes called Silent Hattie. She was known to be a strong supporter of President Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal, especially as it related to farm relief and flood control, because those were the people of Tennessee. They needed farm relief and flood control. I'm sure we all know the Tennessee Valley story. Since she had come from a farming family that struggled to make ends meet, and since she ran a cotton plantation while her husband was a lawyer, she felt her constituents were her friends. She was known as a senator who would help a constituent if she could. It has been reported she was methodical in tending to constituents' requests. So her offices, they took the request, it went all the way up the chain until she could figure out how to deal with it, or the people in her office were able to figure out how to deal with it. She had reservations regarding the U.S. entrance into World War II, but nevertheless supported Franklin Roosevelt. And I just think Eleanor had something to do with that. And she disliked lobbyists. Is that familiar? Unless you're a lobbyist. And she was a strong supporter of veterans. She had a number of firsts as woman senator. She was the first woman to chair a committee, the Enrolled Bills Committee. She was the first woman to preside over the Senate. She was the first woman senator, the first senior woman senator when the other senator from Arkansas dies in office. She was the first woman to run a Senate hearing with the gavel in her hand. She sat on the Commerce Committee and the Committee on Agriculture and Forestry, which makes sense, again, because she came from a farming community. However, we still have to say, her record on civil rights is a mixture. She supports Lucretia Mott's Equal Rights Amendment in 1943, but she votes with her Southern Bloc against the anti-lynching laws of 1938 and 1942, which is hard to understand where the pressure came to not be against lynching.
I don't understand why
Right.
lynching would be legal in the first place, and that's what I was going to ask you, how could it be legal?
Well, it's not legal, they just didn't have a law against it, if that makes any sense.
Murder.
They never went after the people that did the lynching. She also joined the Southern senators' filibuster to defeat a proposed bill to eliminate the poll tax, which again was against African American people. But on her final day as senator, she received a standing ovation from her all-male colleagues. After retiring from office, President Roosevelt appoints her to the Employees' Compensation Commission, and Harry Truman gives her a post on the Employees' Compensation Appeals Board. She served on this board until her death. She suffered a stroke in January 1950 and passed away in December 21st, 1950. In Falls Church, Virginia, and buried with her husband Thad and her son Bobby. This is Hattie and Rose in the Senate when they were serving together. So Hattie's on the left, yeah, and Rose is on the right. And that, ladies and gentlemen, right on time, is the story of the first 3 women senators. I would just like to point out that at the front of the book here, I told you I'm a history buff. So during COVID, I connected with the National Constitution Center in Philadelphia, and they had all these marvelous webinars that you could sign up for free. Jeffrey Rosen is the executive director. Last week at the JFK Library, they had Jeffrey Rosen, who wrote a book called The Pursuit of Happiness, where he studied George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, John Quincy Adams, and Benjamin Franklin on what their thoughts were on what it meant in the phrase, the pursuit of happiness. And I guarantee you it wasn't a new SUV, a bigger house, or a pool in your backyard. Those men got up in the morning before sunrise and read Plato, Cicero, particularly Marcus Aurelius, all the classics, and they exchanged ideas. And the final conclusion is that the pursuit of happiness means, in our democracy, we bring people up. We work together to make everybody better, and we constantly improve ourselves. And that is the secret to happiness. And that's not talked about very much. On the webinar this coming Thursday, March 28th, retired Supreme Court Justice Stephen Breyer wrote a book on reading the Constitution, why he chose pragmatism over textualism. So not reading the Constitution as the words, what those words are, but what they would mean to us now in the world that we live in today. And you can sign up for that on the website for the National Institute. And I guarantee you, you will very much enjoy. And if you wanted to hear Jeffrey Rosen's talk on the pursuit of happiness, it's still up on the JFK library where you can plug into past, they tape it, and you'll see me make a comment. Then I also have Hattie's book. Someone wrote a book about Hattie with a basic, there's lots of pictures in there with her constituents. And this is the Rebecca's book, no pictures. And then I invite you all to take a bookmark with our Therapy Gardens website on it. We have a newsletter that comes out once a month. It will direct you to recipes, to topics like mindfulness and getting better sleep. There's always really good essays there, and it's just we're very proud of our website, so you're invited to sign up for that. So I'll be around for a little while if anyone wants to talk or take a look at what's up on the table here. And please take a bookmark. Thank you.